Okay, so I did a video on compartmentalization, uh, basically of the like a scientist going to work and using his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is your executive control, logical reasoning, working memory, and then leaving work and switching to his or their ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is the emotional, spiritual sometimes, and living their religion and getting the rewards for belief and compartmentalizing those. And I used just basically talked about it in a religious or versus a like a scientist or doctor. And but I want to talk about compartmentalization in a broader sense of what can happen with the problems with compartmentalization and other things. So, real quick, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is in charge of executive control, logical reasoning, working memory, task switching, rule following, abstract planning, um, and it suppresses pulse is in favor of long-term goals. For the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is value-based decision making, integrates emotion, reward, and social context, and helps assign meaning, especially moral or emotional meaning. So, just so you have those two, we're going to just basically use those two. So, the dangers of compartmentalization. When when these circuits stop integrating and start in isolation, acting in isolation, rigid reasoning, lateral prefrontal cortex alone, you'll be cold, overly analytical thinking, detached from emotional or social reality. It can produce Spock like reasoning that feels inhuman, and emotional driven evaluation, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, overly subjective, guided by affective salience rather than facts, and decisions feel right but ignore long term logic. When the ventral medial prefrontal cortex overtakes the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we get bias towards immediate reward. So the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is tuned to hedonic value. It can overweight immediate gratification like comfort, eating, addictions, compulsive behaviors over the abstract long-term planning. Emotional rationalization, instead of letting the dorsolateral weigh evidence, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex can hijack reasoning, leading to post hoc justifications of what feels right. And an example is following a leader or ideology because it feels true even when the evidence contradicts it. There's distorted risk assessment. Ventral medial prefrontal cortex integrates fear, attachment, and social belonging. If unchecked, it can minimize real risks, ignoring warning signs in abusive relationships, cults, or scams, or exaggerating others, like catastrophizing. Loss of cognitive flexibility. So, if the dorsolateral supports working memory and flexible rule switching. Without it, behavior can get locked into rigid emotional frames or habitual scripts. The moral, ethical vulnerability, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is strongly tied to moral emotions, guilt, empathy. Without the dorsolateral balancing with logic and consistency, morality can become situationally based, situationally biased, favoring in group over out group, endorsing harm if it feels justified. So, in clinical and everyday manifestations, neuropsychiatric links, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex hyperactivity and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex underactivity are seen in depression, rumination, addiction, PTSD, emotional triggers override planning, and some anxiety disorders. Social political parallels over reliance on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex can fuel groupthink, susceptibility, and to charismatic leaders and or conspiracy belief systems because it felt true and it outweighs the evidence. So bottom line is that healthy decision making requires the integration of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the emotional moral valuation, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the rational planning. And when the ventromedial prefrontal cortex then reasoning gets bent around emotional drives and the ability to delay gratification. So weigh the evidence and stay flexible erodes.